once again. When your story gets torn and some pages go missing, when your plans turn to geese and leave you behind, when the prize that you find is that one day you realize the world isn't reading your mind. What can I say? Just be good to your sweethearts and God.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So he doesn't want this one?
Everybody seated? Good morning, everybody. Let's get seated.
I'm ready, John.
All right.
Sam, test your microphone.
Testing.
Yeah, it's all working.
Hey, Kevin, how you doing, bud? I just did. I'll do this. Testing. It's a little loud, isn't it? That's okay.
Well, good morning. Thanks for being here. And this is our fourth class in Food, Faith, and Farms, and I appreciate all y'all being here. Why don't we bow our heads in prayer? Dear Lord, thank you for this glorious day and all the gifts you've given us, including this natural world. Help us to see better ways to be better stewards of your gifts and watch over us all in the days ahead. Amen. All right, so Sam Adams is going to teach the second class. He's alive and in person. Mark Douglas, who is going to teach classes 4 and 5, is here. So, we got Joel over here too. So a lot of theologians are in the house. So I feel like a politician introducing. All right. So I think most everybody knows Sam, but I know this. He is an awesome teacher because he can teach to a computer. It was so impressive last week, so that was great. So he teaches he's a professor of Old Testament at Union Theological Seminary up in Richmond. He is Joanna and Al's son, and we're thrilled to have him here. And with that, I will turn it over to Sam.
Morning, everybody. Well, let me just take a moment of personal privilege. It is, well, when you got all these professors here, you better get your stuff right and not make anything up. Well, it is an honor to be here. I guess I'm an adolescent, late college student of this church, as I said last week. It was a very special and formative place for me. It's where, my mom came in, 91, is that right? And when I was at Davidson, and just have dear friends of all generations, many of whom are here today. So it's special to be here, and I appreciate special relationship with Joel and Rebecca as well. Joel is on the editorial board of the seminary's journal, Interpretation, which I edit, and I will send a link to John to share with you. You can subscribe. Joel has as you know, Joel has wonderful musical gifts, and he has a essay coming out on John Coltrane and the Psalms. So that's in our next issue, which is on the Psalms, and then we have an issue coming out on the Bible and film. So really interesting stuff. So anyway, and so grateful for Rebecca's leadership, and I will start now. I want to review a couple of things that we talked about last week. And because we didn't have as much time for questions, I was joking a second ago. That's the first time I've ever taught on Zoom where I couldn't see the screen. I was saying to Halsey, I felt a little like Tom Hanks in that movie Castaway talking to the volleyball. I wasn't sure what was happening on the other end of the screen, but I'm glad at least some of you heard a little bit of it and were able to glean a little bit. So anyway, so we want to go over just a couple of things from last week to reorient ourselves. How do we answer the question of diet in the ancient world? We look at biblical texts, we do archaeological analysis, pottery for cooking, eating, animal bones. And the other thing that I didn't mention is archaeologists have found ways to study human bones to ascertain what diet was like and what deficiencies existed. Were there zinc deficiencies? How much protein were they getting? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So there's lots of, really sophisticated analysis that can take place that was not available just a few short decades ago. So we know a lot more about the diet in the ancient world than we do today. We also do a comparative study of neighboring cultures to sort of see, what was happening in Rome, what was happening with the Babylonians, what was happening in Egypt, and in some cases there's similarities, in other cases not. All right. Again, this is reviewing. This is why I'm going fast. This was a bread, grain-based diet. At least half of the caloric intake, Hebrew lechem means food, and bread, same word. Much of the wheat is known as hard or durum wheat, can grow in dry climate. Barley is more resilient, easier to grow, but not as prized. I mentioned last week there's an archaeologist at Duke named Carol Myers who's doing what she calls gender archaeology, and she's written a book called Rediscovering Eve, in which she says that women formed what are known as female solidarity networks for cooking. And she's able to argue this because archaeologists have found at many sites houses that backed up to each other with a common cooking oven in the courtyard. As any of you who've tried to bake your own bread from start to finish know, it's a very involved process. And the cooking takes some time, and there's evidence both in the Bible and outside of it that this was a communal effort. And that a good example would be the book of Ruth. In Ruth 1 and Ruth 4, when Naomi is talking to the quote-unquote women of the neighborhood. Myers' assertion, and I think she's correct, is that this is indicative of the fact that overcooking, this was an opportunity for information to be shared, for support to be given, and for gossip to occur. And by gossip, I mean not so much, tabloid stuff, but just information about what was happening in the community that would be beneficial for others to know. And so it was the process of bread making almost certainly fell primarily to women, was involved and probably occurred more in groups than individually. I mentioned wine and oil. These were the two things that olives and wine are the two things that the Israel-Palestinian region, Judea, is most known for exporting, both in the ancient world and today. We do have evidence of oil being shipped in port cities in jars, as well as wine. And as I mentioned last week, this was not in any way a teetotal culture. They drank. And wine had nutrients, especially the darker grapes. And the other thing to note is beer was also fermented and drunk, but it wasn't the Bud Light variety. It had more nutrients in it, and was something that you could have that would provide more nutritional value. All right. Not a whole lot of emphasis on vegetables. It's undoubtedly the case that they were eaten. A lower assessment of them. There's only a few references to them in the Bible. But we do know that varieties of fruits were grown, as well as certainly legumes, lentils, and other types of beans, especially the ones that flourish in dry climates. All right. Now this is where I stopped last week, and now I'm going to slow down because I have a bunch more slides beyond this. Meat was not eaten on a daily basis. One interesting thing is there's no real evidence of widespread chicken consumption. It doesn't mean it wasn't eaten, but there haven't been a whole lot of chicken bones found. If you think of your Bible, there's not a whole, I don't know, maybe Joel can correct me, is there even a reference to chicken in the Bible at all? I don't think so. The cock crows, yes, okay. I guess, but he's got to be alive. They can't eat him because he's got to do his morning duty. I mean, there's every indication that chicken, I mean, I'm not saying chicken wasn't eaten, but I don't think it was a staple of the diet based on what people have found. Certainly fish bones in certain areas, especially along the coast, not in others. Often meat was reserved for festival observances, special occasions. Meat was more of a delicacy, more of something that you would eat at holidays and festival celebrations. Now, if you are not a regular meat eater, and this is an area in which others of you would be bigger experts than me, especially John and others, what are you thinking about in terms of nutritional deficiency if you have primarily a grain-based diet? Society was broken up into two groups primarily. Pastoralists, you think of Abraham and Isaac, who were more herders, a bit more nomadic, and would have had less, so they weren't as sedentary. In some cases, they had access to farms, but if you were more of a pastoralist, you would have greater access to milk from your animals, perhaps protein from the animals you shepherded and herded, but you would have less food security because you would not have the stability that comes from being on one particular plot of land and the produce that it would provide. So there were tensions, but if you were, on the flip side, if you were more of an agriculturalist, one thing archaeologists are asking now is, would they have had greater nutritional challenges because they weren't eating meat as much? For those of us, when we talk about this today, my wife Helen is a primary care physician, and she has a full-time nutritionist on her staff. It's not like Abraham could go see his nutritionist to make sure he was getting his zinc. They were trying to make do in whatever setting they could have, but primarily meat was definitely not a daily staple. It would have been a more occasional staple. Any questions about that? Comments? Thoughts? All right. I want to talk for a minute about what they didn't eat, because we haven't touched on that yet. And this would get into the whole question of keeping kosher. There is a distinction that has been made primarily among Jewish scholars in looking at the Pentateuch, at Genesis through Deuteronomy, primarily at the food laws and the laws related to human conduct. And they've made a fundamental distinction between ritual impurity and moral impurity. I'm not getting into what constitutes moral impurity today. We're only talking about ritual impurity. It is a temporary state of impurity from being exposed to animal carcasses, corpses, bodily flows, leprosy, those kinds of things, semen, any number of other bodily fluids. If you come into contact with them, you are in a temporarily impure state. It needs to be said that there's nothing sinful about that. There's nothing wrong about that. It is simply the ebb and flow of human existence. And so, but there is a sense of the sanctity of the Lord in the temple, the ability to go certain places, to be in contact with members of the community, and there was, I guess, conscientiousness about that. A part of ritual impurity, though, was eating forbidden foods, and certain things were not to be eaten. And there seems to be, I guess, I don't want to say, it's an eclectic diet based on what you can and can't eat. And some of you know a good bit about it, but I'm going to remind for those who may not know as much just how it worked according to the Bible and then subsequent Jewish law. Most of the laws related to food impurity and others are in Leviticus 11 to 15. Ritual impurity, temporary and could be corrected. I just put some representative examples. Divided hooves and chewing the cud. Animals that chew the cud are okay, which of course would leave pigs out of the equation. Fish with scales are fine. So what did I have for, we went to 6 Feet Under on Friday night and I had oysters, so that's bad. But I can have trout. So shrimp no-go, but you can have bass. So there is differentiation. Shellfish are not okay. What accounts for the randomness of this list? Is it respect for life, concern about disease? Only the meat of cows, sheep, and goats may be eaten. The good example would be anything in the streams that does not have fin or scales, of the swarming creatures in the waters, and among all the other living creatures in the waters, they are detestable to you. So what's going on here? It's not a vegetarian diet, but it is a diet that eliminates certain forms of meat and includes others. And I should note, the aversion to pork is something that's also carries over into Muslim communities, very much, even probably a greater taboo there. So among the theses for why this is the case, one of the best ones I've seen is from a really famous scholar who wrote a book called Purity and Danger named Mary Douglas, in which she argued that it was an attempt to bring order into existence, to give people certainty, to give them a sense of balance and purpose, especially during crisis periods. We have to remember the ancient Israelites were constantly enduring persecution, invasion, exile, a succession of colonial powers: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. And in the midst of this turbulence, Douglas's assertion in Purity and Danger is that the dietary framework provided order to existence. It gave them balance, purpose, and just a template for being righteous to God that I think was really important. And lest we, talk, if we, I guess, I think it's really important that we not sort of make the move to say, well, Jesus undid all of that. Jesus sort of, Jesus eradicated the need for all that weirdness about food. That's not true. Jesus was very intentional about the meals he presided over, and there's every reason to believe that Jesus kept kosher, that Jesus was an observant Jew who kept the Sabbath and adhered to these laws. And so, in that sense, we can find solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters, even if we decide that we're going to have a pork chop. I'm not saying don't have a pork chop. What I am suggesting is that there is an intentionality to these laws that I think for your Jewish friends and mine, and then for others of us amongst us who have, who are vegan or who are lactose intolerant or whatever it is that leads them to have the diet they have, I think we need to be respectful of difference and not accuse others of rigidity. Because this type of framework is characteristic of most religions, that there are dietary aspects of it. Let me stop there and see. So the other thing that is really a constant refrain in this material is that God is holy, so we should attempt to create a holy community on earth. And that involves sanctification. That involves a process of making sure we are hospitable to each other, we care for each other. This is the section of Leviticus that says, love your neighbor as yourself. That you love your neighbor as yourself. This is where Jesus got it from Leviticus. You sanctify yourselves and be holy, for God is holy. Don't defile yourselves with any swarming creature that moves on the earth, looking back to Genesis. So any questions about any of that before I go forward? There's a couple, yes.
How is leprosy temporary?
That's a good question. In some cases, they lump temporary skin disease and label that everything as leprous. So if you have a rash, if you have just something going on your arm, a lot of times the Bible or the Hebrew would refer to that as leprous, even if it's not leprosy, because as you rightly note, leprosy cannot, in most cases, is permanent. So that is a catch-all phrase for any number of skin ailments. Yeah, it's a good question. Yes?
It's a swarming creature.
Birds, ants, insects, crickets. Joel, I think the one exception, I think they could eat locusts. Is that right? I feel like there's an exception line in there that you can fry up locusts. So I have to go look. Anyway, but it's insects, things that crawl on the ground. And yeah, and most birds. Yeah, waterfowl. I think there are a handful of birds that can be eaten. And you can eat and again, the other thing to note is this has evolved. I mean, there were hundreds of years of engagement with how to interpret these laws in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, in the Jewish commentaries on this. So there's reams of tradition beyond about what constitutes being able to eat kosher. And it's perfectly acceptable to eat chicken. Like I have a friend who's a rabbi in New York, and he eats chicken all the time. He's just got to go to a kosher deli to get it. So this tradition has definitely evolved. All right. One of the things that we talked about last week that we want to remember, though, is how precarious things were. As you think about all these laws, the biggest issue was whether you were going to have something to eat. And I said this last week, but it bears repeating. Terrible, precarious conditions were not the exception, they were the norm. That life was cyclical, difficult, and could at any moment lead to food insecurity in the biblical world. And so rather than orient ourselves towards the fact that Mary and Joseph or Isaiah or whoever we're talking about had periods where for most people in ancient Israel, life was always difficult, and disease, infant mortality, and food insecurity was a regular aspect of life. Here's just one example. We don't know how historically accurate this is, but it does point to realities on the ground. The fact that there's a famine going on, and there are farmers who are having to put up their sons and daughters as collateral in order to buy grain and live. We're having to pledge our fields, our vineyards, our houses in order to get grain during the famine. Coming back to thinking about the number of times in the New Testament when you have debtors, you have tenants who are laboring on vineyards or farms to which they have no property claim. This was very much the case during the world. This is during the Persian period and then on into the Roman period. Notice how during periods of famine, if someone is food insecure, if someone does not have the resources they need, oftentimes they have to borrow on their land in order to get grain and live. And in most cases, the interest rates were amortized or risen. The technical term is anti-credit. In other words, the lender could change the terms of the loan and demand 3 or 4 times what the original loan amount was. The corollary, of course, to this today is payday lending, where this has been documented in Georgia and elsewhere. If someone needs to borrow $200 to repair their car, they're going to end up, in most cases, having to carry over the loan and pay 300 or 400% more than the original loan. This was the same in the ancient world. I also want to point out, this is a passage that you all know, but this is from the prodigal son story, just how common famine was and how it's mentioned just in passing in this famous story from Luke. The son squanders his property. He'd spent everything. A severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. Again, a cyclical thing, a common thing, not something that happened once every 7 years, but something, if you had a bad harvest, if there was a drought, it's something that happened quite regularly. All right. Now I want to talk about, I may not read this whole thing. The other thing I want to talk about today is communal meals, which is something that I think I was just talking to Anne about, where her kids and grandkids are living, and my kids are now, we're empty nesters, and isn't it the case now that, our offspring just move all over the country? And we sometimes lose the communal fellowship that comes from having a clan living in one space. This was not the case in the biblical world. They had regular festival celebrations. We're coming into the time of Passover, and this dates back to Exodus. Tell the whole congregation to gather. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. So you pool together your resources. It talks about how to divide it. It's got to be a year-old male. Keep it and take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts. Eat the lamb the same night. Eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it in raw or boiled water, but roast it over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. So real specificity about how the meat is to be cooked and what is to go with it. As any of you who've been to a Passover celebration know, bitter herbs are eaten to this very day at most Passover celebrations. I want to emphasize today, though, the intentionality, the care that goes into the preparation as a model for us, as well as the communal aspect, the pooling together for those who don't have enough, and the fact that it was done as a group to honor God. So just some characteristics of communal meals. Hospitality. God asked Isaiah, "Is not this fast I choose? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house?" If someone doesn't have the food they need, you're to ask them and to ask them to join you at your celebration. A good model for this is Abraham, who has visitors in Genesis 18. He doesn't really know who they are. They end up being very special visitors, but they are given an opportunity. They come into this sacred space, wipe the dust off their feet, and are given vegetables, cakes, a roasted calf, curds, and milk. They are welcomed by Abraham as treasured guests. There is a sort of an emphasis on hospitality as a core commitment of what it means to honor God. And that core commitment and hospitality revolves around meals usually. God provides. We read Psalm 23 all the time, but we read the Greek version of it actually in the last verse. The Hebrew says, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life," not forever. And I'm not going to get into it. So that's not a reference. We certainly affirm the resurrection in our tradition, but that end of Psalm 23 is not a reference to eternal life. It's a reference to God providing for us all the days of our life, and that provision includes and is predicated on the provision of food. That God will provide us what we need. God, the earlier in the psalm it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." You provide the sustenance I need. You provide the stability I need. That stability includes food. God will provide for us. The third sort of leg of this, and this is a really key point today in our sort of fractured, diverse society. I was talking before, I went to go see a friend of mine on Friday, and I stopped off in Johns Creek and when I was leaving, and I have a friend who teaches with Joel at Emory, who I'm editing a book with, named Roger Nam, who's Korean American, and there's this huge Korean community in Johns Creek, and I stopped off and had some spicy squid for lunch. And it's just incredible to me. We were talking about how in the city of Atlanta, or in greater Atlanta, you have pretty much every global community represented in different neighborhoods with any kind of food you would want to find. And those communities are, in some cases, there's lots of ways of plugging in with them and building greater solidarity. But my point in raising that is to say outsiders are welcome at communal meals. They're not just welcome, but there is an insistence that they be included. Any alien residing among you who wishes to keep the Passover of the Lord shall do so according to the statute of the Passover and according to its regulation. You shall have one statute for both the resident alien and the native. So there is an emphasis here on inclusiveness, on making sure that someone who is sojourning in your midst is welcome at the Passover. They've got to keep the regulations. They have to try to adhere to the way it's supposed to go, but they're welcome. And I just find this to be a really important mandate for us as believers during a time when there's so much xenophobia and sort of, belittling of the other that's happening in our world right now, that it is incumbent upon those who keep the Passover feast in the biblical text to welcome those who are residing among them. Yeah.
Interesting to think about bringing this up. The tension in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament seems to me a constant pushing back against authoritarianism. I mean, Jesus and Paul were killed by authoritarian government, and then this community, building community, and that.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, there is a.
Pull those together, and then when you're a church, that's kind of part of the power structure. Many of us are. What do we need to be thinking?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's the question was about the fact that you had this small sect of Jews who were following Jesus, Paul, Jesus, among others, who really felt the book of Acts. Certainly, the ends of Paul's letters are a testimony to this, that they felt that it's almost like crisis creates community. The crisis of persecution that some of them experienced created community, and they got together, as I'll show in one of the next slides, they got together over meals in this regard. That was one of the ways in which they were able to share news, share fellowship, and to create community with each other, and they took that process quite seriously. And John was like, how do we recreate that today? I have some questions on a slide or two, so we'll come back to that in about, we're going to run out of time, so I better keep going. All right, and yeah, hang on.
In the Isaiah portion that you just, from Isaiah 58.
Oh, I went too far. Ooh.
Well, but
There it is.
Share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house.
Yeah.
I just want to tell a brief Atlanta anecdote. In about 1979 or 1980, little bitty Clifton Presbyterian Church, which now is sort of out of business as a shelter now, not a church. But they were doing a Bible study, reading the 15th chapter of Isaiah. And honest to goodness, they went out of the church and got in their van and rode around downtown Atlanta, picking up people who were homeless on a cold night. And that began the entire shelter
Oh, that's amazing.
in the city of Atlanta.
That's amazing. So from reading Isaiah, oh, that's amazing.
That's just an amazing thing.
That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Clifton was. I remember in the 80s, they were leading everybody, and they were one of the smallest churches in the Presbytery of Atlanta. Appreciate that. All right, so I have some questions, and this gets back to this segues into or just dovetails with John's questions. But I'm going to sort of go through these, but then you can ask anything you want, and we have a few minutes for discussion. What can we take from this biblical witness? What do you take from it? What does it make you think about? What do you want to push back against and say, I don't want to think about that. I do want to think about that. How can we claim or reclaim the importance of food preparation and intentionality with what we eat? And what are some ways you're thinking about doing that with just as you seek balance in your lives? How significant are ceremonial meals in your life? And if they're not significant, how significant do you want them to be? Finally, I've been doing Helen and I are trying to do more of a Mediterranean diet this year, so far in 2024. And I've been working with a trainer in January and February, and she said, she sent me this meme and sort of said, a lot of people say, I'll do anything for my family except, watch what I eat, work out, or take time with food preparation. Other than that, I'll do anything for my family. So if we say we would do anything for our family, should that include greater intentionality around food selection and preparation so that we can respect God's good creation and live longer? Those are some questions I think that are born by what we're seeing in the biblical text, and we can address those or others. Just sort of, we'll open up the floor for anything you want to talk about here or with anything else I've talked about. Anybody have any questions? I can keep talking too. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So obviously in Nehemiah, you see the oligarchy at work. Not much has changed there in modern times.
No.
I would say this is a really complicated subject in my opinion, because we're facing this such a power of how this is directed through social engineering, social programming, through the connection to brands and consumer product goods, and what has become a behemoth of an industry, right? Which has nothing to do with nutrition or your lifespan at all.
No.
And so we're really disconnected, and as the world becomes more secular, as you're saying, it loses connection to this purpose and this labor that's necessary to bring groups together and have an agrarian society, which I think we had at one point. We had this in this country.
Sure.
The question is, how do we get back to that? How do we power against that force that is really prevalent? If you see it in teenagers, they're bombarded 24-hour loops of never-ending advertisements of all junk food, and it's all processed, and everything is synthetic nature. What I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
So it's complex. We're plagued with, this is a quote from Margaret Thatcher talking about since the French Revolution, we've been plagued with isms, right? And so it's that secular nature, how we're all deracinated as a populace. And, my question is, how do we get back to teaching more about this group effort?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And how do you do it in a way that, and you've obviously been part of that discussion, how do we do it in a way that is invitational and constructive and community building rather than scolding? And I think that, to me, that's a huge question, as well as how do we do it in a way that, one of the things I've heard, Andrew Young talk about this, among others in Atlanta. You've heard many people talk about this. One of the realities too is that in more urban areas, those are some of the hardest places to find the foods one would need to eat nutritious food. The access to produce is often the hardest to find in cities. So how do we do this in a way that maybe brings us back to some of the roots of, and you're right, the United States, one of the things that, there's a guy named David Shai, who used to be president of Furman University. He was a professor of mine at Davidson, who wrote a book called The Simple Life, Plain Thinking and High Living in American Culture. And his point is that for most of American history, we were small agrarian communities much closer to the biblical model. And it's only in, the end of the 19th, into the 20th century, obviously a number of industrial advances were hugely important and helpful for us as we live our lives. But his point is that we've lost something. And his question is, how do we get back to the simple life, at least in certain aspects? And he points specifically to meals and food preparation as areas where we really need to take an effort. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking back at something, and some of us are in the same age group. After World War II, there was such a growth in junk food.
Yeah.
I think what I grew up with, and literally had what do you call it, those cereals?
Sweet cereals, yeah.
Yeah, I never served those, except for him who likes spicy. And I would say that when I was growing up, it was one of the worst times for bad food, because people were hungry for something delicious that they had been without during rationing time and all that. And men coming home, my father wrote about what they had and what they didn't have, and what he craved when he came home. I think that was probably fairly universal.
Yeah.
I do think, and I'm Pollyanna, I'll admit it, but I do feel like we are moving toward a conversation about healthier foods, about communal gardening, about not eating junk food.
Yeah, they are, yeah.
It starts in the family, you know, what do you serve, what do you sit down at the table together, how do you think about food you eat, then it goes into community, and then it needs to be a national conversation.
Absolutely.
That, you know, what are we doing to respect God's good creation? That's the best.
I guess one thing to come back to your 2 points, though, is how can we have the national conversation such that it, you know, I'd love us to find a way to have it such that it doesn't just devolve into, well, the MSNBC people say this and the Fox people say this, and we just, you know, bicker about food in that regard. Is there a way to have it in a constructive, non-scolding, uplifting way such that we don't get into stupid arguments about whether we're banning, you know, big gulp Diet Coke bottles? I mean, because that's not constructive. Yeah, shut down the media. That would be that would be the first step. There was a question, Halsey had a question.
I think the simple answer is become more agrarian.
Yeah.
I truly believe that. I mean, in gardening, you grow and connect with nature and God.
Yeah.
And you do it usually early in the morning or late at night as you're more reflective. And when you build community gardens, and there's several urban community gardens here, and our son's out in Colorado. There's many in Colorado. We've actually signed our son up for one.
That's cool.
And it becomes a communal effort to maintain this garden and to share community. And then the food is better than the processed food that's being sold to us all the time.
Absolutely.
So there's things to do.
There are. We just, and I mentioned this last week. If you're ever up in Richmond, send me an email. We have the largest urban farm in the Commonwealth of Virginia on the corner of our campus at Union. It's called Shalom Farms, and now we have 3 greenhouses and 14 different crops that are being grown in the city of Richmond. So it is possible, but it takes intentionality and commitment from communities. I know we got to stop, but maybe 1 or 2 other questions. There's a hand over here. Yeah, Ruth.
I think eating together is important.
I do too.
Having a family meal that people sit down as a family together at least once a day, I think can make a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Not just what's on the table, but the community.
And, you know, the rhythm of food preparation and communal meal is something that I think, you know, maybe my parents' generation were better at than we are, and I think we've realized that, you know, in the Joel and Rebecca and Mark's generation, I think there's sometimes a tendency to, you know, you've got swim practice and instrument practice, and kids go in 3 different places, so, you know, it's like 4 different meals are served, none of which are eaten by, you know, the same person at the same time, and if there's a way to reclaim that, we have to try. Because if there's a regret I think Helen and I have is that, you know, during those middle and high school years, we kind of fell off of that. And it's mostly just because of kids' activities. So, yeah, that's a really good point. Is there one last question over here? No? I think we probably need to stop, don't we? 10:46. One more, Rebecca.
I think part of this is also about curiosity. And this is, I think, where Dan was trying to go. It isn't just about choosing broccoli over Lucky Charms. It's also about knowing how your broccoli got to your table.
Yes.
And where it was farmed and how it's totally boxed in plastic
Yeah.
and wrapped up and how long it's been sitting somewhere or was in a truck driving across the country.
Absolutely.
Conversation started about meat in the last some kind of years. Dan will know better than I do about how much waste is created to create each steak. I remember reading that in the last 10 years. But even the things that are good for our bodies, that are healthy foods. If I open my refrigerator, it feels so great about the fact that there's always broccoli in it. There's always going to be a thing of fresh strawberries in it. Even those good things have become part of a system of sourcing that is hurting our environment and our labor force and our culture and our
Absolutely.
everything, right?
No, that's right.
And the system is really not the system. Gosh, listen to me. The structures around us don't engender curiosity about sourcing.
No.
And that, I think, is probably a step that's easier for people than starting a farm.
Yes.
Trying to ask the questions about where did this come from?
Yeah, where'd my broccoli come from? Yeah, yeah.
Who picked it? How long has it been in a truck? How far did the truck drive on diesel fuel?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
It's a place we could start.
absolutely. Yeah, exactly. How much was used to create these? Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's such a good point. And, some people are getting more curious about that. And I think, I want to go, where is Bluffton, Georgia? I want to go visit this guy's farm. 3 hours south? Okay. I've never been to Bluffton, but these kinds of conversations, I think, are only going to increase.
Just an encouragement, is it the communal meals we have here as a church? We have barbecue, I don't know, that this, so the idea that.
Another good question, right as I stand up.
Let just be on curiosity. How could it be shaped? How could the dinner, the spaghetti dinner that's coming up, the teenagers are doing, why aren't they?
I'm stepping aside. Yeah, we got to let Rebecca get to church.
Thank you, Sam.
What's that? Yeah, sure. No, you can. That's fine.
So, thank y'all very much for being here. Sam, thanks so much for traveling down from Richmond, and that was absolutely awesome and enlightening. I'd like to give you, speaking of Bluffton, this is Will Harris's book, A Bold Return to Giving a Damn. Two things on that. One is,